I'd like to introduce Constance Coleman, the President and CEO of the American Feed Industry Association, to moderate this next panel. The panel, Building Links Along the Food Chain, Enhancing the Sustainability Conversation, is sponsored by the National Cattlemen's Beef Association. So Constance, go ahead and take it over.
Well, thank you so much, Casey. I really appreciate the opportunity to join the Animal Ag Alliance for their virtual summit. It's been some excellent programming, and I don't think anyone will be disappointed by our next session, Building Links Along the Food Chain panel. We have a wonderful topic in that sustainability, as we all know, is not a new concept, but it is an evolving one. When we talk about sustainability, each company and sector may have its own approach and metrics, but they definitely rely on efforts and of others up and down the food chain to deliver the sustainable products to the consumer. Add to that, to the mix, the conflicting messages about what sustainability means, and it only makes building links an even more critical function. So for today, we have an exciting and thought-provoking panel to explore this topic. We have with us Molly McAdams. Molly is a PhD and is a retail advisor and Texas cattle rancher. She draws upon her previous experience as vice president at HEB. Molly will share her thoughts on why food retailers are interested in sustainable practices on farms and ranchers. Following Molly is Lee Bob Harper, a veterinarian associate director of Beef Strategic Technical Services at Zoetis. Lee Bob's going to share a deeper look at innovations in animal health and the correlation between healthy, productive animals and sustainability. And then bringing up the conclusion of the conversation, what I think is a very exciting addition as a topic, is Marianne Smith Edge. Marianne is the founder and principal of the Ag Nutrition Edge. She's a registered dietitian. She has some farming roots and helps food and ag companies find their path through the changing and complicated consumer food environment, and serves as a translator between the consumer and the food ag space. She's going to draw upon her experiences to share consumers' perceptions of animal agriculture, technology, and sustainability. So now I would like to actually turn it over to Molly, who's going to kick us off with a pretty interesting presentation. Molly.
Thank you so much. I just wish that I could be with everyone today, and I'm sure that you all feel the same way. It is just one of those things that we're all in this same boat. So let me pull my slides up really quickly and make sure that you all can see this. And actually, I'm going to have to share my whole desktop, so I apologize for that. But here we go. So as Constance said, I think that one thing that is kind of interesting about my perspective is not only am I a meat scientist, but I also worked in retail for several years. And then I married into a ranching family here in Texas, and we ranch over 7,000 acres, kind of north and a little bit west of Houston. And so end to end, I've had a really interesting perspective in looking at meat and why it matters all the way through the food chain. Hopefully I can present some of these ideas to you, and then we can have a rich discussion afterwards. The bottom line, which is what retailers and food service operators are always interested in, is meat matters to them because it matters to a consumer. When you look at fresh categories, almost 50% of a store's sales in retail come from fresh categories. And if you drive it down to the meat consumer, of all those fresh categories, the meat consumer is actually a higher frequency shopper. When they shop, they have a bigger basket ring. And ultimately, when you're trying to sell groceries at retail, you want a shopper that shows up frequently, and when they show up, they buy a lot. And that's the meat shopper. So it's a good shopper, and that's why they're very protective of meat at retail. But in addition, I mean, take a look at the stat from Anne-Marie Roerink around household penetration of retail meat sales. At 98%, really categories that would be higher than that in penetration, you're looking at things like ice and milk. That's exceptionally high penetration. And then moving on to food service, ultimately you know, burgers are still the #1 sandwich that's ordered in restaurants. Now let's talk a little bit about consumers. And because our topic is around sustainability, is we shift over to consumers and what sustainability means to them. And this is not exclusive, keep in mind, but primarily consumers are thinking about the impact of animal agriculture on the environment, and they're also thinking about animal welfare. So from those two perspectives, recently in the Power of Meat survey, I thought this was great news. Almost 50% of our consumers believe that if done correctly, animal agriculture doesn't have a negative impact on the environment. I think that's great news. Over half consumers want brands to provide more information about how their animals were raised and information about the meat source. Again, I see that as a very positive thing as a retailer, because that means a consumer is interested in engaging with you. Because COVID has had such a significant impact on all of us over the past very short while, I wanted to have a little stat in here about what's happened with grocery shopping since our world got turned upside down. This is very interesting from the Hartman Group, and it shows that in the past few months, 20% of all consumers have ordered groceries online for the first time ever. This number is actually higher for Blacks and Hispanics. Now, I don't know what this will mean further down the road, but at this point in time, what's interesting about that stat is an external force has impacted consumer behavior, certainly in the short term. My thought is it's going to continue to impact consumer behavior in the long term. Now let's talk about producers, consumers, and a story. So this funnel is indicative basically of how our industry is shaped when you look at meat animals. Of course, it's a bit more fragmented in the beef cattle industry, whereas pork and poultry tend to be more vertically integrated. But suffice it to say, it's a long way from a producer to a consumer, and we don't talk directly to consumers. We rely on other folks along the food chain to communicate messages for us. So what's really important about that is consumers increasingly want storied foods, and it's hard for us to get our stories to them. That doesn't leave producers off the hook. We have to continue to find ways to communicate with consumers. And one of the main ways, of course, is to do a better job of communicating with those merchants that are closest to the consumers, like restaurants, like retailers. Now I'm going to switch topics to, or kind of evolve into a conversation of between the beaches. I invite all of you to listen to a podcast by this name, from a man by the name of Brad Fairs, and he is a cattleman out of Florida. And basically what he tees up and what he's talking about are the millions of acres of wild country that ranchers and stockmen and agriculturalists control. The reason it's so important to me is this is a huge part of any sustainability conversation. So even though the population centers are on the left side and the right side of the country, between the beaches is where habitats for wildlife exist, where clean water is sequestered, and frankly, thriving rural communities usually thrive because of thriving animal agriculture. It's something I'm very passionate about. A common conversation is that there are too many cattle in North America. There are too many cattle in the United States. In fact, 30 to 60 million bison roamed the US in the 1500s. Now there's 93 million head of cattle in this country. But if you look more specifically at Florida as a microcosm, I'm a native Floridian, and I think all of us can imagine with the shape of the state of Florida, those beautiful beaches on either side, what happens in the middle of that state. And back years ago, if you think about it, Florida would have been almost uninhabitable for humans before air conditioning. It's tough in the summer with air conditioning. So in the 1870s, there were less than 1 million head of cattle, but only 140,000 people. Then by the 1950s, that ratio completely flipped. 2 million people and only 1 million head of cattle, right, to feed those 2 million people. Now, with exponential growth in the population of people in the state of Florida, that now it's a 1 to 15 ratio of cattle to people. And so when I think of folks who tend to blame animal agriculture for environmental disruption, for pollution, it's really critical that we're able to defend our industry with proving that, and I'm not suggesting in no means that that we would curb population growth. Please get me straight on that one. But it's really important to recognize that population growth has a huge impact on environmental stability in this country. Case in point, LA a year ago and their famous smog versus our mandatory quarantine and virtually no transportation. You can find examples like this all over the internet of what has happened since transportation has basically ceased, and we all become essentially a part of an enormous global human study. So it's really important to recognize the impact that we all have on the environment. Now I'm going to walk you through when I think of rural environments, when I think of ranching and the impact of cattle ranching on all of humanity. What you get with cattle is you get beautiful vistas, you get wide open spaces, and you get gorgeous environments. Water, cattle, flyways for birds, biodiversity for trees, and for grasses. And ultimately what you have is something that will impact all of humanity because it's to the benefit of all humanity. So where our ranch is, just northwest of Houston, it's on the Trinity River watershed. So the Trinity River accounts for about 85% of the drinking water that goes to the city of Houston. So when I talk to Houstonians about our ranch, what I tell them is that the first drop of rainfall that ends up in the water supply in Houston is actually falling on a ranch just like ours. So land fragmentation and land use change is rampant, and it usually is a result of kind of a decreased possibility for monetizing normal agricultural practices. When land fragmentation occurs, it doesn't usually go back into more rural spaces. In fact, what happens as ranches get sold off, they turn into suburban or urban areas. The rain still falls on those areas, but then it's filtered through asphalt. Cars drive through it, and the water that we're able to sequester off of urban or suburban areas is no longer clean water sequestered, it's actually contaminated water. In addition, flyways go away and we lose wildlife habitat. So as you can see, I'm very passionate about the meat industry, but I'm also deeply passionate about how animal agriculture contributes to sustainability for all of humanity and these beautiful spaces. Now I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Harper so that he can talk a little bit more about growing practices and further explain sustainability and how it affects animal agriculture. Thank you.
Thank you, Marianne. Or Molly, sorry, do we have Lee Bob available?
Yes.
Fantastic. Take it away, Lee Bob.
Okay, thank you. See if I can get the slide to advance here. There we go. All right, thank you, Molly. I was talking to one of Molly and I's mutual friends last night in San Antonio, and he's an individual that's been a mentor of mine for a long time. And he's one of those individuals that when I need a little pep talk, a little pick me up, a little motivation, a little confidence, I give him a call. So I gave him a call last night to talk about this big event today and the privilege I had of being on a program with Molly, and was hoping for a vote of confidence. And he said, do you speak before Molly or after Molly? And I said, after Molly. And he said, well, good luck with that. So I didn't get the vote of confidence that I was looking for, but thank you for the setup, Molly. My role today really is to talk about innovations from a veterinary perspective and really from an industry perspective. I grew up in this business, fifth generation in the cattle business in the little hometown where I live. Cow calf, stocker, feedlot, and farming. So I bring that perspective plus the veterinary side of the equation. But really what I want to talk about today is how in the last 60, 70 years, we've progressed from raising cattle 100% in an environment such as the picture on the left to at least part of their lives, the last 150 to 300 days, depending on what age and weight they go into a confinement setting. We've progressed to the picture on the right. Now, it's very obvious that anyone who looks at these two pictures, going back to Dr. Levinovitz's wonderful presentation earlier, would look at the picture on the left and say they would equate that with natural. They would have a hard time equating the picture on the right with natural. Outside of the ear tags and those that one cow's ear and that one calf's ear on the left, that looks like environment, quote unquote, as we heard earlier, is God intended it. And I think you brought up a great point that if we try to get into the argument on that turf, that, you know, we can equate the right to natural, that's a difficult one. That's a difficult conversation to have. But around the concept of sustainability, I think that we have quite a strong leg to stand on. And that's what I hope to illustrate today. Now, of course, sustainability can be, it's a nebulous term. It can be defined in so many different ways, as I believe one of the previous speakers, I believe it was Allison, noted that just changing one word qualifier, one adjective around sustainability had such an impact on the market research. And I completely see that because there's so many different ideas out there around what sustainability means. But to me, and again, going back to what Dr. Levinovitz said about you know, our need for simplicity, there's no more simple definition for sustainability in my mind than doing more with less. And I've used the cattle industry as my object lesson here today. That's where my love and my passion and my roots are. But I want to say that I could overlay just about anything in agriculture and get a very similar chart here. We could look at corn production. We could look at pork production. We could look at poultry, dairy. Over the last 70 years, people in those industries have had one thing in common. They've all done more with less, which to me, again, is the epitome of sustainability. Let's look particularly with this chart at beef production. Billions of pounds on the left vertical axis, average yearly inventory of cattle, including everything from the ranch all the way through the production system, the confined production system. That millions of head of cattle would be on the right vertical axis and years on the horizontal axis. And if we look back from 1950, which would be, you know, we were starting to feed cattle in confinement then, but had been for a little while, but most of the beef raised would have been that picture on the left that I showed you for the duration of the animal's life. And if we go from 1950 to 1980, we increased production directly proportional to the number of cattle that we had in inventory. If we wanted to increase production, the only way we did it was to increase the size of the cow herd, ultimately increase the number of animals further down the chain. And that was the choice that we had. Now, I'm not going to say that no innovation was occurring there, because I do believe the relative land use that we were using related in comparison to that increase in inventory was something to be lauded. But the fact is that required more and more and more and more land and more and more and more and more resources. So really the innovation all kind of occurred at an evolutionary pace up until 1980, when we had kind of this perfect storm and this pickup of the clip to more of a revolutionary pace. And a lot of things converged right there. A lot of things started to happen at once that I'll talk about later. But the point is, today in 2020, we're producing a whole lot more beef with a whole lot less animals. And to me, again, I don't know how you can define sustainability any better than that. Who's been the beneficiary of that? Some would say, would look at me and say, hey, you get a paycheck every 2 weeks from a company that's been around for that entire ride, originally Pfizer Animal Health back in the 1950s, and you've benefited from it. a lot of profit in there related to the technologies made by pharmaceutical companies. That's not all. We'll talk about some other things in a moment. And I fully acknowledge that's true. I have benefited from it. My family's benefited from it. But I can make the argument that the population as a whole has certainly benefited from it. If we look at the percentage of our discretionary income in the U.S. that we use on food, it's pretty close to unrivaled around the world. Total food, we've reduced the percentage of discretionary income associated with our total food purchases from about 17% to right at 10% in the last 60 years. Most of that has been driven by what we spend on food at home. And that has allowed us to spend more food away from home. I know that's only gone from about 4 to 5%, but that's a 25% relative increase over 60 years. And if we've seen anything through what's happened in the last 6 to 8 weeks, we certainly know what impact food away from home has on our economy at large. So all of this production that I talked about on the previous slide and that sustainability, the consumer has ultimately been the beneficiary of that. We could take away all the technologies that have driven that and assuming not a huge decrease in demand due to the price increase of beef that would deliver. You know, the producer would probably adjust, and as long as they're all on the same playing field, it wouldn't impact them that much. It would impact the consumer. The consumer's going to have to pay for it. I think Alan Greenspan had a quote back in his time as chairman of the Federal Reserve, smart guy, and I've got it written here that really summarizes this chart. He says, the phenomenal gains in the U.S. agricultural productivity of the past century brought profound benefits to all consumers, regardless of their connection to a farm, in the form of lower prices and more choices at retail outlets. Although dislocations are bound to accompany economic growth, we should rise to the challenges that come with innovation, because innovation brings great improvement in material well-being. The consumer has been the beneficiary. How have we gotten there? I don't want to at all discount. In fact, I want to highlight the value of genetic selection. If you look back there at that 1980 point of transition when we started to make more with less, a lot of what was going on there was artificial insemination, which allowed better selection of sires and better genetics. And better genetics resulted in more efficiency and higher quality. We have the highest quality of beef now that we've ever had in history. I haven't looked at the updated numbers, but you know, at one time last year or earlier this year, we were running 8 to 9% prime carcasses. Forever we ran 2%, and that was, you know, that was considered, there's no way past that. And we've quadrupled it in a very short amount of time. And a lot of that has come through genetic selection and the technology that provides. Husbandry. This goes back to a lot of what was discussed earlier in the week around animal welfare. We've made great gains in facility design, in the way we handle cattle, and understanding more about their flight zones and their fight or flight response. And that has led also to greater efficiency and sustainability due to the work of people like Bud Williams. Housing goes along with husbandry. We've made great advances there. Also has been done on the dairy side of the business. Nutrition, and here's where I want to use an example, that not all innovation that leads to sustainability comes in a bottle or in a bag, or is a result of 10 years of significant R&D investment. In probably the 1970s, I would guess, it may have been earlier, but really started to pick up steam, no pun intended, as you'll hear in a moment, in the 1980s, was the idea of steam flaking corn. Prior to that, we fed whole kernel corn to cattle. There was a time then that we cracked that corn, and then nutritionists and producers realized that we could put these devices on feed yard mills, these big steam flakers. We could deliver a relatively small amount of water. This isn't a huge water usage or energy usage practice. Apply a small amount of water, some heat, steam that corn, put it through a roller, and basically make a cereal or a corn flake out of it, and made it more palatable, and also increased the efficiency of feeding corn to cattle by about probably 10 to 15%, on an energy basis, even better. Now, that was bad news. I know there's probably some in the audience that they're in the corn business or represent the corn business. At that time, that was bad news to the corn farmer. But I live on a block within 100 yards of my house. There's 7 different corn farmers with a collective experience of probably over 300 years. And one of the things that I've benefited just from knowing them and watching the way they work is corn farmers are very, very resilient, and they're very creative. And when one market shrinks, they find another one. Ethanol came along afterwards, and there will be another example in the future because they're very resilient. This is one way, just a very simple thing. Unfortunately, it probably wasn't done with the idea of sustainability in mind. It was one of those things where necessity is the mother of invention. Corn prices were getting to be a large input and needed to find a way to do more with less. And this innovation did it. Health protocols. We're certainly aware, and this isn't so much around sustainability message, but we're certainly aware of the consumer thoughts around antibiotic use, and we need to be more and more judicious about that. The need for antibiotics in cattle, if you're going to balance it with well-being and welfare, is not going to go away. Cattle get sick, we're going to have to treat them, but can we do a better job of identifying them at the right time, using the right thing, and treating the right cattle? And I think that's the next wave of innovation in our business, looking at the huge advancements that have been made in precision farming, following along that line. How can we use technologies, GPS tags, different things to track water and feed consumption and know which animals are sick and when they're sick and get the right antibiotic in them at the right time. Reduce antibiotic usage and at the same time keep animals healthy. And I believe that's the next frontier, and there's some exciting things around the corner. If we look at these last 3, hormone implants, beta agonists, ionophores, I know those names just bring a connotation to mind, again, of unnatural, unhealthy. But the fact is, these are very, very well studied. They're very safe for human consumption of these animals in which they're placed. One example, if you look at hormone implants, beef consumed from a non-implanted steer has 1.4 parts per billion of estrogen. Beef consumed from an implanted steer with exogenous synthetic estrogen has 1.8 parts per billion per serving. That's 4 parts per billion. That's a blade of grass on a football field. That's a second in 32 years, just to give you some perspective around that. Those last 3 there, if you look back to, there was a paper published by Jude Capper in Journal of Animal Science back in 2012, just looking at those 3 and a couple more technologies, and said, if we still raise animals in confinement the way we do today, but we take these technologies away, here's what would happen. We would need 10 million, and this was all cited in the paper with calculations and assumptions. We would need 10 million more cattle. That's double the number today in Kansas and Iowa. We would need 81 million more tons of feed. That would fill 1,010 Rose Bowl stadiums. We would need 17 million more acres of land. That's the land mass of Scotland. We would need 138 billion more gallons of water use. That's household use for 1.36 million households per year in the U.S. 4 to 8 more packing plants. You could argue in our current situation that might not be a bad idea to have, but we would need those to accommodate the lack of these technologies. And we would produce 18 million more metric tons of CO2, which is the emission of 3 million cars driven annually. And those additions to the paper were courtesy of Sustainable Beef Resource Center. That brings me to the second to last slide here, talking about the need for us to balance this argument. Oftentimes, what I see on social media and what I see from consumer research is that those who are very concerned about some of these consumer preferences, whether it be around grass-fed, organic, non-hormone treated, antibiotic-free, locally sourced, are some of the same people who have concerns about sustainability, however they want to define it. And I think we have to understand that every action has a reaction. And I know there was a speaker earlier in the week who said, they want all of these things. And I think we have to communicate that sometimes when you get one, you give up another. If we were to go to, let's just say we went back to 100% grass-fed type of environment with no technology, 100% natural again. Thomas Elam and Rodney Preston published a study about 15 years ago where they did some calculations, and a lot of these calculations are a lot like COVID-19 models. They're built on a lot of assumptions, and people can argue with the assumptions. They basically said that that's the extra landmass that we would need, the black area. That means no one could live there. There could be no national parks. There could be no other industry. We would need that just to supply our domestic and export beef demand today. Now, if we didn't, we would have to import more. You're looking to places like Brazil, and they would have to destroy millions of acres of rainforest in order to accommodate that. So there's always a give and a take. And I think, I'll just use a personal anecdote to tell you that we can engage in these conversations. It's possible. It does take time, because for every one of us in agriculture who take these things for granted and understand them, there's 99 who it's not their fault. They just don't have the exposure, so they don't understand. So they're at the mercy of whatever tweet they see or whatever their neighbor says. But these conversations can be had with this generation. Not picking on millennials. I think they have some great qualities, and I actually enjoy working with many of them. And I found that they will listen, and you just have to be able to engage them. And again, a personal anecdote, I mentored a young man while he was in high school. He went off to the city, got exposed to some other perspectives, and that's good. And I noticed on his social media posts that he was very concerned about sustainability. Just kind of followed him. And then one day he posted something about one of these beef technologies that I referred to before being, and it was negative. And knowing that, his generation doesn't really like to talk on the phone, I didn't call him, but I didn't respond publicly. I just sent him a private message, and I said, do you want to know more about this? And he said, yes. So I explained to him some of what I've talked about today, and this balance, and that if we took those things away, what would happen from a sustainability response. And he actually went back and retracted the post and cleared it up. So again, is it possible? Yes.
Yep. And Lee Bob, that's actually a perfect segue to Mary Ann, I think, because she'll have something very similar with on the nutrition side, some of those trade-offs. So that's a great segue to that. Thank you very much. And Mary Ann, I'd like for you to pop in.
Thank you, and I realize the time is short, so I will move through this, and some of the slides that I will talk about have actually been communicated in previous. So I'm very glad to be part of it. I too am a sixth-generation farm owner, but come from a dairy background rather than beef, but combining the nutrition as well as the ag side. It's really important to talk about here about balancing nutrition with the sustainability conversation. Next slide. When we talk about, as mentioned in the previous panel, as well as Molly and Lee Bob, sustainability is the conversation across the food value chain, from producers to definitely the CPG companies. And even though as shown on this slide, there may be various ways that individuals are addressing sustainability, it's still being addressed. And it also brings home that, as was mentioned previously, sustainability is a broad conversation. Next slide. In fact, last year with the Mintel, when looking at consumer trends, is that it was defined, rather, sustainability as evergreen consumption, where consumers are really looking at the broader view of sustainability spanning the entire product life cycle and really upcycling. In fact, as it was noted here, like nutrition, sustainability will become an expectation for companies to offer to consumers. Next slide. And as Ali had mentioned, and myself being a former IFIC individual, I think the one thing here is that, as we've known, when it comes to purchasing, taste and price is definitely top of mind for consumers. Sustainability has some importance, but we see, as noted previously, that when it's defined as environmental sustainable, the importance wasn't quite as high as previous years. So when we go to the next slide and we look at about overall the importance, the interesting thing here is that over 50% of consumers said that they place some type of importance in how their food is grown and produced sustainably. But I think what was mentioned, and I think Ali mentioned it as well, but hearing the other speakers is from their perspective, it is mentioned more as being labeled locally or as non-GMO or organic. Again, kind of going back to what our keynote speaker mentioned, kind of tying in that natural holistic concept. But then when we go to the next slide and looking at, we see that adding to that conversation, over 50% of individuals not only say it's important to know where food comes from, but they also say that knowing that the manufacturer or the CPG company basically has produced it in an environmentally sustainable manner is really important. It may be important, they may not truly understand what that actually means. So when we move to the next slide, please, is that when we talk about looking at the whole sustainable development goals, and every CPG company commodity is really looking at some of their sustainability platforms based on this. And it's really from where did nutrition and sustainability really converge. And I'd like to think that even though we were talking about that in tandem in the 1980s, really in 2010 at the FAO conversations, did we really start talking about, well, how was the 21st century diet going to really connect human health as well as environmental health, where previously we'd only worked on human health before. So I think it's important when we look at is that it was from this conversation that the 17 sustainable goals, and of course number 2 is the reality is where we all focus, as well as some of the other ones, on achieving zero hunger by 2030. So as we talk about the sustainable goal developments and move to the next slide, is that I really look at when we talk about sustainability, it really isn't one person. When sustainability first started popping more from the business side of looking at that triple bottom line of planet, people, as well as economics and profit. So the sweet spot is that something truly is sustainable if it is environmentally sound, economically viable, and provides that health and wellness and social well-being. Next slide. And as we know is that even when we look at that sweet spot, and definitely looking at some of the animal protein, and this was mentioned in a previous presentation, is that people still have looked at the whole concept in a different lens. And of course, in 2019, the Eat Lancet Healthy report came out and making reference to the healthy reference diet. And I think what's interesting is that even though it was, of course, encouraging decrease in animal protein, and part of it was from the fact saying that, and then the kind of response is that what's really radical about this is that they're really asking us to consider more impact on the environment than an impact on our body. And again, this is where some of the conversation has really abound about the from animal protein versus plant protein in this regard. We know that really the credibility of this whole report and diet was not received as well as what the intent originally was. Next slide. So when we really look at how do we look at the convergence of sustainability and health, and in an article in Nutrition Today on balancing nutrition and sustainability that I had the opportunity to author, I really have looked at overviews of modeling studies. And I think some important points to really feature here is a publication by White and Hall basically says that, modeling studies show that regardless of the eating pattern, there are going to be environmental consequences. So if we only eliminated animal-based foods in US-based diets, the reality is that we would only see a less than 3% reduction of total greenhouse gas emission. However, if we went to a total plant-based diet, we would need to increase food production by 23%. We'd have excess energy supply, and there'd be some deficiency of key nutrients. Adam Dranowski from the University of Washington gives us good food for thought, because when we think about comparing animal-based and plant-based diets, we need to focus on the outcomes and what's considered quantifiable dietary terms. What is the nutritional aspect per 100 calories versus 100 grams to really be accurate in making those greenhouse gas comparisons? Next slide. So the bottom line is that regardless of an animal or plant, there's really no single solution to address food sustainability without unintended consequences. Next slide. So to do this, we have an opportunity as a food value chain to first balance the challenges. I think from all our conversations in this panel and the previous one, we can see that there is a lack of clear understanding around the complexity of defining and measuring sustainability across the food value chain. And we can see that even though consumers say that sustainability importance, we do know that there's a personal commitment many times of what they say and do still exist. So when we balance the challenges, we also have an opportunity to create opportunities, as mentioned in the next slide. So food waste was mentioned in the previous panel, and I'd like to think about it on even a bigger, broader base, is that moving our conversation from sustainability, it's not animal versus plant, but really looking at that whole food waste. 40% of all food is wasted. And food waste, it was a country, it'd be the third largest release of greenhouse gas. And so even in the Eat Lancet report, it said it's important that we position modern ag practices at the forefront of solving the sustainable food problem. As Lee Bob said, feeding more with less. So in the final slide, sustainability really is the core of our existence and our conflict. And if sustainable diets, as defined by Dranowski as the 4 pillars, are to be nutrient-rich, affordable, culturally appropriate, and respectable of the environment, then we really have to looking at the collaboration and consensus building essential across the food value chain. It is about making sure that we produce more food, more nutritious food with less resources, and it is affordable across the food value chain for our consumers in the US as well as globally. Thank you.
Now you can see why Mary Ann was our anchor speaker. That was a beautiful job, I think, Mary Ann, summarizing a bit of what we were hearing during the conversation. I'd like to ask Lee Bob and Molly to rejoin us for a Q&A section. I'd just like to actually take a quick moment and talk a little bit about what I heard, and I'd be interested if the audience heard some of the same things. I heard a couple of things. One is with Molly's presentation, really making sure that we pay proportionate attention to the things that are actually really impacting our global challenges. And so I thought, Molly, your presentation where you went through, if not animal agriculture, then what? And, how much of the problems that we're viewing actually stem from animal agriculture. And I think that's important because sometimes much of the onus of correcting things is put on a small part of the problem rather than the bigger contributor to the problem. And so we're willing to do our part in animal ag, but we also need the rest of society to do their part too, to have a real significant impact on that. So I thought that was beautifully presented, Molly. And, Marianne, your part about some of the understanding those trade-offs and the value to that balance. And Lee Bob, you touched on that as well, because, we really do have nutritional trade-offs if we change our diet dramatically. We also have a lot of trade-offs when we start talking about different kinds of production systems. Some may be good in one way, but have negative implications in another way. So how do we actually resolve that, and how do we take a look at that? And then Lee Bob and Marianne, I think you both spoke to this, and Molly, you alluded to it, is that animal ag can be a value proposition as a solution. We've got some innovations that are happening within the private sector and the public sector. We have a lot of different improvements to production methods and things that we're doing very creatively, where we can actually begin to be not focused on minimizing impacts from a sustainability perspective, but actually offering a value proposition to be an asset to challenging those particular problems. So really fascinating discussions. I thought they were really very interesting. And we actually got 4 questions in from the audience that I think speak to that quite a bit. One, I'm going to try to roll a couple of these in together because we did talk a little bit about different types of production systems. And we talked about a little bit on natural labels and absence labels. And oftentimes, I think I've heard people refer to those as proxies for sustainability. If consumers don't understand what it takes to sustainably produce something, and we're not in there filling that vacuum of information, other folks do step in and provide definitions, whether they necessarily accurately represent the system or not. And so one of the questions that we got was, how do we actually take a look at the contradiction? So we see like some of the younger generation wanting to have natural, but yet they love their smartphone, right? Or that they also want lab-based meat when they say that they want natural. So is there some confusion in there? And how do we kind of resolve that and get to that point? So I'm going to start, Marianne, with you, and then Lee Bob, and then Molly on that, if we can.
Well, I think to your point, there is confusion, and the reality is that there, as even the previous panel mentioned, is that there's a lack of clear and clarity on what sustainable is. And even in our conversations is that when it's not really just environment versus economics versus health and wellness. It really is a combination of all three. But in many times what we think about from sustainability, you're right, from the natural standpoint, is folks want to go back to what was brought out in that survey is local as being non-technology. And I think that's an issue we've dealt with in agriculture technology, is why the non-acceptance of it. But I think the more we are transparent and we talk about that, the combination of the three, plant, people, and the economics, is if we can build that strategy across the food value, it brings some level of understanding.
I'm sorry, Lee Bob, your thoughts on that? Thank you.
I think it goes back to, there was a speaker a couple of days ago, Dr. Croney, who said something that really caught my attention, that I'm paraphrasing, but something to the effect of, we got to have the conversation with these individuals to really understand what it is that's driving their thoughts and what it is that they want. And when we can better understand that, we can better educate and we can better provide information. And, I think the example I gave earlier is my, my personal experience that you've got to be able to have the conversation, and it can't be, it needs to not be contentious. It needs to not be over social media. It needs to be somehow one-on-one, and you got to have some kind of rapport and relationship to do that. And again, it takes time, and that's something that we're all going to have to invest, but I think it's a worth it.
Yeah, thank you. It actually reminds me of an instance with antibiotic use where some people say they don't want any antibiotics used, but yet they don't want sick animals. So what they really want is responsible, right? So responsible use.
Yes.
So that's a great example, I think, too, of something that I've run into. Molly, as a producer, your thoughts?
Well, I kind of look at it from a producer perspective, but also, working in retail for so many years and interacting with consumers in a retail environment, it taught me how to be very, very patient with consumers and understand that, sometimes they're asking a certain question and they exhibit, what I call schizophrenic behavior, but we all do. So it's not, I'm not saying that as a ding on any particular consumers. We're all that way. And so part of it is just kind of understanding, like Lee Bob said, where are they coming from? What is their motivation? What is their interest? And I've probably gotten pretty good at understanding people that just want to argue with me. And, no matter what I say, I'll be wrong. Then it's easy to say, okay, we're going to disagree here. But most consumers aren't coming at it from that perspective. And unfortunately, it does take a tremendous amount of time. And it's so much effort, and there are a lot more consumers than there are producers as we get further away from agriculture. So this is not an issue that's ever going to go away. It's not the millennials and it's not Gen Z. It's every generation that starts to interact with food.
Absolutely. I totally agree with that. And, one of the things that kind of came up in one of the questions also is how do we communicate and how do we bridge or bridge that gap to retailers and restaurants. And Molly, you alluded to that in your presentation that, there's a lot of people in between there. So do you want to expand on that thought a little bit more? You kind of touched on it a bit, but to directly address this person's question.
So that's actually a lot of what I've done since I've left HEB is I've kind of been in these conversations along the food chain where there's either manufacturing or production that they don't really know how to talk to retailers. And since I was one, I help facilitate a lot of those conversations. What I've noticed, and of course I worked for HEB, I think that HEB was always on the forefront of wanting to get closer to all of production. And it doesn't matter if it was agricultural or goods and services of other types. They want to get close to production. So I learned that as a retailer and used that to model how it could work for other companies. And what I've noticed though is there's been a very significant sea change. Retailers, restaurateurs, whether they're individuals or whether they're distributors, they want to learn more about how food is produced and how animals are raised. And honestly, I still see that as a great thing for our industry because it's opening the door for the conversation. We're not trying to kick the door down. The door's open. We just need to invite ourselves in and say, and be confident in our voice to talk about what we're doing and what we think is important and impactful.
Great point. So another person asked the question that sustainability could be a scary word to farmers and ranchers because they think it means that tools are going to be taken away. And Lee Bob, your point was right on about the fact that sustainability sometimes requires more tools, not having tools taken away. Do you want to kind of address that a little bit? Because I think innovation oftentimes is missed as an important part of being able to meet these sustainability needs.
Yeah, I saw that question, and I think it's a great one because I agree. A lot of times out here in the middle of America, in the middle of agriculture, we hear sustainability, and we do one of two things: we get scared or we get offended. And I would say, don't be scared, don't be offended, embrace this. A lot to what Molly said, embrace the opportunity for the conversation. You have a great story to tell. The farmer and the rancher were sustainable before sustainable was cool. And let's tell that. That's what I would encourage. And let's do it the right way. Let's have civil conversation. I heard a lot about civility in the last session, and I think that's very important. And let's tell our story, because we have a great one to tell. And I don't fear that innovation is going away because of this drive towards sustainability, regardless of how it's defined. I think it's just going to create opportunity for more innovation.
Thank you. And we've got a question in here about the deforestation in the Amazon rainforest, and they've cleared a lot of rainforest for grazing lands and things for beef down there. And I know that this could be a whole session in and of itself. So I'm going to kind of take the liberty of pointing out that, I think when you're looking at two different types of ecosystems, it is important to understand the natural ecosystem of a place. And of course, the Great Plains is a perfect ecosystem for a lot of those grasses and things and forages and things that work well for animal agriculture and beef production, in particular here in the U.S., where it's not the same kind of situation down in Brazil, but yet there are some opportunities there for them to tackle that sustainably. I'm going to actually start to wrap up here, but I do want to ask very question, 30 seconds, less than 30 seconds, what's your number one piece of advice as we go through here and look at recommended action items for moving forward? 30 seconds, Marianne.
I think the important thing is to be transparent and clear on really connecting sustainability to animal agriculture, as mentioned, but also talk about the benefits from the nutrition standpoint as well.
Thank you. And Molly.
I would say it's to kind of put yourself out there. It's your way of life, it's your living, it's your education. Use it for the greater good.
Fabulous advice as well. Lee Bob, you're the anchor there.
Embrace your story, tell it, and don't forget to tell it to your own children and grandchildren. Don't assume they'll pick it up by osmosis, because my own child came home from school with some what I would consider misinformation. I had to clear it up. Don't assume that and neglect it.
I work on all 53 of my nieces and nephews in lieu of kids, but I'm there on it. So thank you all very much. We really appreciate this. Has been a fabulous discussion. Really excited to share with everyone their Twitter handles. Molly, you win for the most creative at Gator Mama Molly. You hands down, you win that one. But you see the Twitter handles of everyone there. Follow some of these folks. Good stuff, and I really appreciate your participation.